and yet you still have mortgage rates that aren't really at a, they're at a good rate, but you don't really see a lot of people buying homes. So, and the fear of inflation hasn't really set in yet. When do you think that Ben Bernanke should really address the interest rate and start to bring that up and so the inflation fear doesn't really take over the market?
Yeah, great question. So just to make sure everybody got that. That question is worthy of an ovation. Well done. So it has to do with interest rates and the observation that the Federal Reserve has a policy of keeping short-term interest rates very low. At the savings bank or on a money market fund, you're earning a very low rate of interest, maybe 1/10 of 1%, 2/10 of 1%. Mortgage rates are not quite that low. They were in the fourth quarter about 4 3/4%. Now they're about 5%. They've moved up some. And one does read in the paper some concerns about beginning of inflation and a worry that if the Federal Reserve adds lots of money to the system, it might lead to inflation and we might have problems down the road. So I'm much more in the camp, as you probably can tell from my comments, that the Fed is doing the right thing, and I have a lot of confidence in Mr. Bernanke that he can give us a very supportive, easy monetary policy with short-term interest rates for a much longer period of time before we have an inflation problem. And I think at this point in time, that unemployment issue and the housing problem are so large that it's going to be a depressant on inflation. And we need not worry today or this year about inflation. And we ought to keep interest rates low to try and get economic activity going. And later on, maybe in 2013, we can begin to change our policy, tighten it, and have interest rates go up from here. So I'm not as worried about inflation as some. And I also will say that Mr. Bernanke is a brilliant man. He was an economist at Princeton, and his area of expertise, what he studied the most, was the Great Depression in our country in the 1930s. And he knows as much as anybody in the world about dealing with depressed economies and how you get going. I also think he is cognizant that if he keeps that policy too long, it could lead to inflation. But again, I don't think we need to worry about that for a couple of years. Great question. Thank you. Other questions? Yeah, please.
So, you said that it's going to take a very long time to reach the stability in prices. Do you think that once we get there and prices start going up again, we're sort of restarting the cycle and maybe in some situation?
That is a great question. Could this cycle recur? And I think the answer to that is yes, but not for a very, very long time. There's a wonderful economist, a Russian economist, and his name is escaping me, but his theory was that there are massive economic cycles that last 60 years in length. Sure, there are business cycles that are shorter term. There are housing cycles that are shorter term, but there are also these massive 60-year cycles. And do you know why he concluded there were massive 60-year cycles? It was because lessons learned can be remembered for about 60 years. That is, they are passed from one generation to another. And that was in fact true for me in my personal life. That is, my grandfather, who had 6 kids, actually lost his house through, not his fault, during the Great Depression. And the 6 kids had to live in very temporary housing for a period of time. And I heard that lesson from when I was 3 or 5 or 7 years old about the importance of saving, never borrowing money, how debt will get you in trouble, and it just totally impacted the way I live. I've tried to pass that story on to my kids, and they tune it out. And that supports this notion that we are able to pass these stories on from one generation to another for a period of time, but then we forget them after a while, and that's why those cycles repeat themselves. So if I had to guess that when we come out of this, and when there's stability and housing prices start to move again, people will be very careful about borrowing. The customers, again, will be careful about borrowing. The lenders will be very careful about borrowing. They will say, remember what happened back in 2006 and 2007, 2008. You don't want to go through that again. Be very careful. And I think we will remember that story for a considerable period of time. But I also think your question is correct. At some point, people forget those stories. They get a little bit greedy. And they see housing prices go up, and it probably will repeat itself sometime way, way down the road. Other questions? Yes?
Do you think we companies were adequately punished for all of their actions?
Yeah, great question. Do I think the executives who were part of the problem, and remember I talked about some of the bad behavior, have been adequately punished. And I think the answer to that is some have been and some have not been. And there are two types of mistakes that those former executives made. One is well-intentioned but colossal bad judgment. And I think the people who were dumb or colossal bad judgment probably have been punished enough. They have lost their jobs, and many of them have lost most of their net worth. Because their stock went to zero. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac stock has gone to zero. So lots of those executives own stock in it and it's gone to zero. There are lots of executives at Lehman Brothers where the stock went to zero. And they've lost lots of their net worth. So those people who were running companies and made really bad judgments have lost their jobs, lost their money, and I think they've been adequately dealt with. But there is another class of people. I think it's small compared to the first class I just described, but there are a class of people who, where it went beyond bad judgment. And it was unethical behavior and, in some cases, illegal behavior. And I don't think we've adequately dealt with those people yet. I think society needs to know that the people in that category are going to be treated with criminal activity and have to go to jail. And I think we have yet to deal with some people in that category. And I think it would be good for the country overall in terms of feeling that there was some justice, and I think it would be helpful in learning the story for future generations. That story that I talked about in my prior answer, I think that a couple examples of people who lapsed over into illegal and unethical behavior and then went to jail would be a good thing in terms of people remembering the lesson going forward. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What benefits come from
I'm sorry?
What benefits come from walking away from this?
Yeah, what benefits come from walking away from your... That is a great question. So, let's take that person who bought a $500,000 house and put $100,000 down, and the mortgage was $400,000 therefore, and the house is down 30%, so it's only worth $350,000. The benefit would be the following. I I own a house that's worth $350, why don't I, but I owe $400. Why don't I walk away from this house and buy the house next door for $350? So I could start over again at zero. Now, one of the things that prevents that is that most lending organizations have a period of time before they will lend to you again. Before, if you walk away from a mortgage, there would be 5 or 7 years before you could get a mortgage again. But there are some people who have other resources and might be able to play a game there. So in essence, what you get to do is start over. Instead of being -50, remember my mathematics got you to a net worth of -50? If you walk away, in theory, you would at least get to zero. So the number one advantage is going back to zero, which is better than -50. But it does have negative ramifications on your ability to borrow in the future. And a lot of people are thinking about the ethical implication of that. Is it a fair thing to do or not? And there's a lot of debate in our country about whether it's fair to the system or not.
One more.
One more, yes, please.
For a while,
We'll see if Pam will let us do two. Yeah.
for a while, people were talking about, people were really pushing refinancing your home. How does that fit into this equation? And is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, refinancing is a great thing, and it's something that Freddie Mac and lenders have been helpful with, and is one of the great things about our mortgage system in our country that lots of countries don't have. In our country, you can get a 30-year mortgage for about a 5% interest rate, and if interest rates go up, you're set at that fixed mortgage rate of 5% for the entire 30 years. Even if interest rates go to 10 or 12 or 15%, you'll never have to pay more than 5%. That's a great deal. But it's even better. I'm like that guy on TV. It's even better. Because if interest rates go low, suppose interest rates were to go down to 2%, you can prepay that mortgage, start over, and have a new mortgage at 2%. So refinancing is what you do when interest rates go down. So interest rates used to be 7 or 8% in our country, and some people took out a mortgage at 7 or 8. We allow them to give us that old mortgage, and we'll write a new one at 6%. And think what that does to their monthly payment. It goes way down. So monthly payment can go down by $500 a month. And that is really good for the family, but think how good it is for the economy overall, because all of these families have an extra $500 a month that they can spend on other things, and it gets the economy going. So that's why the government and the industry has been so aggressive in encouraging people to refinance their homes. And over the past 2 years, lots and lots of it has gone on, lowering their interest rate and lowering their monthly payment. So we'll try one more? Please, yes. No, I promise that young lady, yes. Sorry.
Minimum wage and were able to buy a home that they can't afford. How do you deal with someone who has this problem, who's been unemployed for more than 6 months and are unable to find work? How do you propose to help them to pay their mortgage and give them an incentive to not walk away?
So I think I heard the hypothetical, which was a family that got a no down payment kind of loan, right? And a no documentation loan too, right? Where you didn't have to document your income. You just said what it was. And you got a big mortgage so you could buy a big home. And there was some of that went on, believe it or not, because of greed and because people had seen housing prices go up for 70 years. There were a fair number of people who said, I want to get on that train. I want to benefit from that rising housing market, and I'm going to buy a house that I can't afford and I'm not entitled to. Remember my hypothetical $500,000 house, put down $100,000? there were lots of people who bought a $500,000 house, zero down. They wrote down, they made up sort of what their income was and overstated it so that they could buy that buy. And believe it or not, the industry, the people on my side, bought into it. And the question is, how do we deal with that? Unfortunately, as sad as it sounds, that's one of those instances where the best thing for us to do at Freddie Mac and for the lender is not to modify that loan, change the interest rate, do what we can to keep the family in the home. They're just not going to be able to make it. And that's one of those situations where, regrettably, we've got to go to foreclosure, take that home from that family, and have them go live someplace that fits more into their economic circumstance. You can't, it's not fair for the rest of the society to come up with some special arrangement to keep them in a place that they never had justification to be in. So those are exactly those situations where we have to step in and take the property even though it's damaging to the family. Ham, thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity.